The red bloody sky was illuminated by the moon, which for some reason seemed to be cut into two parts. It wasn't just the city on fire that was destroyed. The whole world had fallen. The city that had once been full of light and voices was now plunged into darkness. Everywhere the human eye looked, everything was covered with charred corpses and their body parts, with only hungry rats running between them. On a mountain of corpses that was in the middle of all this hell, on his knees sat a guy. In his hand he held a spear that was embedded in the chest of the man lying in front of him. There was nothing left in this world for him. His hands gripped the hilt of the spear tighter. And he asked in a desperate voice why he could not forgive him. He looked at the man lying before him with hatred and despair. He cried out in despair, "Why did you kill them all? Heavenly demon!" However, all he got in response was silence, because the man was already dead. Even after killing him, the guy couldn't forgive him for destroying this world. Suddenly, a straight ray of starlight that illuminated the darkness headed towards him. A voice followed, calling him the awakened Lee Shinhyuk and praising him for a job well done. He only looked coldly at the person who spoke, who was a woman in a fluttering dress of starlight, with silver hair down to her waist, who was slowly floating in the air. This woman was the goddess Vega, who held many titles such as Vega Star and the goddess of harps. Turning to the boy, she informed him that he had killed a heavenly demon and saved the world. However, sitting on a mountain of corpses and having lost everything in the world, he couldn't agree with her. In response, he only chuckled hysterically. But the next moment, he raised his head and shouted furiously and desperately, asking her what nonsense she was talking about and where it was all about saving the world. Then pointing to the demon's body lying beside him, he asked how it could be called salvation. It all started 10 years ago, on the day when the so-called gate that connected the outside world with their world appeared in the sky. From the gates that appeared all over the land, unknown monsters began to emerge. And it was from that moment that the world truly became a hell. However, as the monsters flooded the world, there was hope for humanity. That hope was the transcendent beings who were also known as constellations. They endowed people with the stigmas of the various constellations, and gave them the strength to resist the monsters. This time was the beginning of the birth of the star-enlightened people. People with superhuman abilities became known as metahumans. With their abilities allowing them to fight monsters, they became the hope of mankind, who seemed to have a chance to win. However, that was until he appeared. This man's name was Kwon Ojin, but he was more commonly known by his other name, Heavenly Demon. In the beginning, he was just an ordinary metahuman like everyone else, but in addition to the powers of metahumans, he also had the power of the Black Heavens, which gave him the power to absorb even constellations, allowing him to grow stronger at an incredible speed. Realizing the threat he could pose, thousands of awakened ones rallied to destroy this monster. The constellations that had always competed with each other joined forces at that moment. Even so, they failed to defeat this monster in human form. This was not surprising, as he was able to single-handedly trample and tear apart thousands of people, and devour many constellations. As a result of this bloodbath, everyone from the good apostles and brave warriors, to the noble constellations, every one of them died at the hands of that monster. As a result, the star called Earth was finished. After hearing his story, the goddess replied that in the end, the heavenly demon had died anyway. Then turning to the kneeling Lee Shinhyuk who had lost the will to live, she asked if he had killed the monster. She spread her hands out and in the next instant, many mechanical gears that emitted a golden glow appeared behind her. She then said to him, "Awakened Lee Shinhyuk, for you who saved the world by killing the heavenly demon, a wish will be granted according to the star pledge." He knew what her words meant. Only the constellations of the polar star could use the oath of stars, which could fulfill any wish. This was not an opportunity he could turn down as it was a chance to change everything. Rising and turning to the goddess, he answered in a determined voice to return him to the past in that case. Vega's eyebrows raised in surprise, and after a moment she asked if he was hoping to regress. Without waiting for an answer, she tried to talk him out of it, asking if he was going back to that horrible past, and then adding that the future of his new world might be even more horrible. But he replied in a firm voice that he knew, then added that this time it would be different. Regressor was the one who went against the fate of the world, and the only being who could rewrite history with an unchangeable ending, which he intended to do this time. She looked at the boy's eyes, which were burning with determination, and silently thought about something. The next moment, however, she replied that she would send him back to the past according to the oath of the stars. Hearing this, the protagonist replied that he had a proposition for her in that case. He then told her to give him the stigma of the star Vega. Upon hearing this, the goddess' eyes opened wide in surprise. When she came to her senses, she immediately began to discourage him, reminding him that a human could not resist her, and that even a heavenly demon could not defeat her. Then she added in a cold voice that even if it was him, the hero who defeated the heavenly demon, nothing would change, as the chance of survival was 1 in 1,000. However, he was unwavering, and replied that if he didn't even do that, there was no point in going back in time. Then asking if she didn't know that. Vega fell silent, as she herself was well aware of it. After a second of thought, she replied that the moment he goes back into the past due to the oath, she will bestow the stigma of the Vega star upon him, and she will also look for him personally. Hearing this, the protagonist was surprised and asked if when he went back into the past she would lose her memories. She replied that she would, but added that he would have her stigma, so she would be able to recognize that he was a regressor. She also added that if he could withstand the power of her stigma, she would accept him as her apprentice. These words shocked Li Xinhyuk very much. He had never imagined that he could become the guardian of the Vega star, which was one of the northern stars, and that what so many awakened people wanted would happen to him. After finishing his preparations, the protagonist turned around and looked at the heavenly demon lying on the ground, telling him that he would remember his face. Then he angrily told him that he would kill him for taking everything away from him with his own hands. The next moment, the goddess held out her hand with a bright golden light and said that she would fulfill her vow. The gears moved and glowed even brighter, while Vega floated in the air, calling him the celestial star, telling him to be careful. Watching the gears appear in the sky, he pondered over the things he had lost and that he had never been able to protect, as well as the many regrets he had over and over again. This time he would definitely change all that. The next moment, the golden sphere shone with an even brighter light, after which everything around him went dark and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he felt like he was floating freely. System windows appeared in front of him, informing him that he had been awarded the Vega star's stigma, while his own stigma began to fade. But after a couple of moments, a red system window appeared and said that because the stigma was too strong, his body was being destroyed. However, he was immersed in his memories at that moment. His younger brother, Li Wuhyuk, was strong enough to be chosen as one of the 12 zodiacs. However, this was not destined to happen. Walking in front of his brother's dead body, he cried out with despair and anger and asked the man standing in front of him why it was like this and why his brother had died. The heavenly demon looked at him angrily and contemptuously and replied that none of this would have happened that day if he had not abandoned him. At that moment, his eyes widened with bewilderment. The face of the heavenly demon seemed very familiar to him, but he could not remember where he had seen him before. However, he had no time to think, because his body surrounded by lightning was in an unstable energy state, which was reported by the system window. His body was beginning to deteriorate, and there was nothing he could do about it. However, he suddenly heard someone's voice who was wondering why he was here. Li Xinhyuk turned around and saw some guy looking at him, and who asked him in surprise and incomprehension if he was all right. He immediately recognized this guy as a heavenly demon. He froze in place, unable to say anything, wondering why he had suddenly appeared in front of him. The next moment he coughed up blood painfully, while the system window sent another notification that his condition had worsened. As he endured the growing pain, he tried to resist, telling himself he had to cope. Even if the chance of survival was 1 in 1,000, or even 10,000, he could do it. But reality was harsh, and in the end he never got to be that one chance. A moment later, the system window displayed the message, "Awakened Li Xinhyuk has passed away." The guy standing nearby looked at the body that had fallen to the ground and frightenedly wondered if he had died. He clenched his teeth in anger. Then falling to his knees, he angrily shouted that if he was going to die, he could at least kill the monsters beforehand. Jumping to his feet and holding a branch in his hand, he panicked and wondered what he should do since he wasn't even awakened. The fear was so overwhelming that he even started trying to bring the body of the guy lying on the ground to his senses. Checking the guy's stigma, he irritably said that he couldn't believe that the awakened guy didn't even have a stigma. However, he suddenly found some kind of glowing blue light mark on his chest that he had never seen before. The next moment, a system notification appeared in front of him, informing him that Black Heaven's first awakening had begun. He wondered with incomprehension what was happening. In the next instant, the system informed him that the Black Heaven was beginning to absorb Vega's stigma. The guy's eyes opened wide in surprise. As soon as the system reported that he had completely absorbed Vega's stigma, his body was pierced by unbearable pain. Writhing in pain and surrounded by blue modelins like his predecessor, he cursed everything in the world, screaming that he didn't want to die the same death. The system saw that the power of the stigma was too great and said that its power would be adjusted according to the stage of development of the Black Heaven. After a while, the mentally and physically exhausted guy sat on the ground, glad that the hell he had been through was finally over. When he saw the system window in front of him, he asked incredulously if only the awakened could see them. Then pulling off his shirt and looking at the sign that was now on his chest, he wondered what had happened during those 5 minutes of his life. But his thoughts were interrupted by the golden light coming from the girl who appeared in front of him. She said thoughtfully and surprisingly that she had definitely felt the energy of her stigma from this place. Then turning to the boy who was looking at her with eyes wide open in surprise, she said that he had a stigma that she had never given to anyone before. She then solemnly announced to him, a star that goes against fate, a creature that goes against destiny. The only savior of a world that has come to an end. So you're a regressor. Those words were probably the last thing the guy expected to hear. A heavenly star and the only savior of the world. You have been reborn, whispered the velvet voice of the goddess, casting a golden glow on Kwon Ojin. But the boy didn't know what she was talking about, how he could be a regressor. He had never done such a thing. He had often been told in the distant past that for a mere orphan, he needed to know his place. Ojin addressed the swarthy boy by the old man. The method of fooling people is very simple. All they have to do is show them what they want to see and let them hear what they want to hear, the old man continued to explain to the boy. Do you think you can do it, don't you? The old man asked, smiling sweetly as he shined his shiny shoes. The boy laughed at the man's appearance so much that he occasionally let out a chuckle. Instead of answering, the guy simply gave the old man a middle finger, catching him off guard. Kwon Ojin, 8 years old. His childhood was truly dark. He was often punched for inappropriate behavior by the seemingly good-natured old man. Even now, his upbringing hadn't changed and he hit what he saw, each time asking the same question, what was their orphanage like? The bruised Ojin relentlessly pointed his middle finger, but obediently, with a slice of sarcasm, answered the bald man that it was a wonderful place. He did what he was taught, said what he wanted to hear. But it only made the educator angry, so much so that the blood vessels on his shiny bald head tensed. The man claimed he'd been good so far, but not now. Rolling up the sleeves of his iron shirt, the old man kept saying that if the little boy wanted to die today, then. Sneaking up behind him, the black-haired girl kicked the old man on the sacred male place, shouting loudly that he should stop picking his nose, calling him bald in addition. Groaning from the pain in the place, the old man shouted at the top of his voice that the children, calling them brats, should stay where they were. But even louder, he claimed he wasn't bald. The irritated girl grabbed the battered boy by the arm and, swearing loudly, saying, "What the hell is this crazy old bastard?" Then she started to lead Ojin away from the orphanage. Stepping out into the daylight, the girl's face lit up in the sunlight and with a wide smile on her face she sincerely inquired if Ojin was all right. It was 10-year-old Song Haein. She was his only support to help him endure in this hellish orphanage. Their director was the best person he knew, because thanks to him, they are able to see meat in every meal. The boy brazenly lied to his parents that decided to visit him for the first time in a long time. And looking at the director of their orphanage, who allowed himself everything, just so as not to leave an injury, the boy realized that he could not die in such a terrible place. That happened at that moment, right? Cutting the sky with purple light, an ominous gate opened on the ground, from which, like sludge, poured a crowd of monsters that no one had ever heard of before. There was a great variety of them, from small to great, from horned to winged creatures. And when the land had become a living hell, there they were. A constellation possessing the mighty power of the star signs. At the same time, with them at hand, metahumans began to appear everywhere, awakened and given the stigmas of the constellations. The guy was deceiving these metahumans and getting a huge benefit, because it was much easier for him to survive among them. Good job today, Quan Gino praised his fellow worker. To which the latter also praised him, because there was a lot of work to be done. After exchanging pleasantries, the comrade asked if the guy would go to the next gate today. Of course, Ojin replied without hesitation, scratching his cheek. He was mad and annoyed, but he was still smiling. Like a leech, he clung to the other metahumans, deftly fooling them and taking their profits. In the squad he pretended to be a high-ranking metahuman. They always did all the dirty work for him, he would just use them and get a huge reward and run away at the end. That day was no different, he had fooled one of them. A loud cry of indignation echoed throughout the forest. A gray-haired guy persistently questioned Quan Ojin, not believing his words that he was a disciple of Aquarius. The one of the 12 zodiac signs in astrology. It was Li Xinhyek. With a wry smirk, Ojin asked the guy not to be so surprised. Even though he's from the zodiac signs, he only has the first star after all. Quan Ojin is the perfect con man. Li Xinhyek introduced himself as a student of Pixies, one of the stars of the compass constellation. Compared to the 12 signs, he is nothing, he replied modestly. Playing his part, Ojin mimicked the excitement of saying what a beautiful constellation it was. It can control direction and orientation in space. And to top it off, no matter what weapon a person uses, it's as if he couldn't feel the weight of the weapons in his hands. The humble opponent, uncomfortable at hearing the praise, corrected the guy. That meant only one thing, the guy was in his hands. Now that he'd decided on a victim, shouldn't he start first? He began by introducing himself with the assumed name of Quan Gino, and by invoking fate, he offered to make up a squad. Li Xinhyek had agreed to such a lucrative deal, but why did Gino need to form a squad with a lower constellation? Ojin explained with an awkward look that he didn't know how to use the stigma at all, and that was the reason why, although he had awakened more than a year ago, he was still just the first star, and Li Xinhyek agreed. Stars. Classes, a type of level, increase already starting from the first star and continuing up to 12. Metahumans increase their level, based on the stigma of their transcendent constellation. While how strong the stigma is and the constellation of the metahumans is important, the importance of knowing how to utilize one stigma should not be overlooked. Baring his chest for confirmation, Gino asked to see his stigma, which actually discouraged the colleague. The actual image of a constellation was visible there. Thinking back to the past, Quan Ojin didn't regret his decision to scratch it out with his blade when he decided to engage in fraud. For the sake of that symbol, he had gone through hell, so everyone should have known what it meant. Ojin had a good feeling for the day, but for decency's sake he still warned his comrade to ignore the low status of the gate. They had high competition, so one had to enter cautiously. After passing through the huge blue gate, the guy suggested putting a buff boost on Xinhyek before the battle. A herd of animals appeared before the guys. Starting the sorcery, Quan Ojin gathered his palms in the shape of a triangle in the mark area, addressing the star sign of Aquarius. The mark, mimicking the response, shone through the clothing due to the activation of the mini LEDs. Please color the darkness of this student, the boy addressed the stars, and light spilled around him, made from the glass powder he had so carefully mixed with fluorescent dye. Li Xinhyek held the spear in surprise, feeling his body grow warmer and his cells awaken. He marveled at Aquarius' strength, thanking his friend for the opportunity to show off all his skills. The trickster himself was glad the trick had worked. Furiously rushing into the battle, Xinhyek, smiling at his enemies, marveled at the power of the buff. Is that what they call the placebo effect? Suddenly realizing, was his name Li Xinhyek? Recalling past shenanigans, Ojin praised one guy's skill, which was no bad thing. For dust in his eyes, he even assured him that he would look into recovering the Mori crystals. The guy was much better than the other metahumans that came his way. Therefore, thanks to the youngster's trust, he would be able to earn at least 300,000 here on the stolen crystal. Ojin held the blue shard carefully in his hands and could not let it fall into the wrong hands, because it was possible to give the crystal the power of stigma. He thought he'd hit the jackpot, but the fact that the surroundings were so quiet made him uneasy. A noise in the bushes caught the attention of one of the guys. Lee Shinhyuk called out to his friend in a frightened voice and held his spear at the ready, pointing at the predators. The boys were surrounded by a pack of hungry armored wolves. Their hard shell resembled a crayfish shell, just as tough and glossy. Something was wrong, the eyes of the beasts surrounding them burned a bright red light ready to attack at any moment. There was a need for action. "Gino, over here," shouted Lee Shinhyuk, scrambling his feet away from the danger, calling his comrade after him. Ojin had spent several years in similar low-ranked gates but had never seen so many monsters. He was confused, not realizing what was going on. The boys were fast, but the wolves caught up to them, reluctant to let go of their dinner. Lee Shinhyuk was lurching, he was scared, he didn't want to die. Ojin was running behind him, and noticing the strange look in his companion's eyes, he wondered why the bastard was looking at him like that. Was he up to something? A sharp kick from his foot struck the guy's face, causing him to cry out in pain. Lee Shinhyuk kept apologizing for his way of survival and ran forward with his heels blazing. Ojin fell to the ground, holding his bleeding nose and cursing the traitor, calling him a son of a bitch. Meanwhile, the predators were creeping up from behind. For the first time he was the victim of deception. Otherwise, both of them would have died, so why should he be the one to survive, Lee Shinhyuk wondered. He really felt sorry. A sudden strike of lightning traveled through the guy's body, making him clench in pain. Something unexpected had happened. Ojin didn't understand what was happening to him. What would he do if Lee Shinhyuk died here? Ojin started searching the guy, he must have something on him. As he lifted the unconscious guy's shirt, he saw the stigma, and it wasn't pixies. Here began the first intensification of the Black Heaven. Suddenly the environment in front of him changed, something appeared before him. A reincarnated man, a man that went back in time. In front of the guy stood a woman in a snow-white dress. The growling behind the guy was more worrying. In literally 5 minutes, he would be torn to pieces by the monsters. But wait, looking into the girl's golden eyes, he remembered Lee Shinhyuk had accurately said that he possessed a stigma that no one else had. This mark was also engraved on Ojin's chest. He wasn't sure why it happened, but he had somehow managed to use the power of the Black Heaven and absorb the stigma of the deceased Lee Shinhyuk. A sudden realization came over the boy's thoughts. The stigma did not belong to Pixis, but to Vega. That could only mean one thing: Lee Shinhyuk was a regressor, he summarized, looking at the motionless body. The phenomenon of the appearance of the blue lightning that traveled through the guy's body before he died was explained by the fact that Ojin had absorbed his stigma. Lee Shinhyuk was returned that he was unable to deal with the stigma. At that moment, the power of the Black Heaven was activated and his stigma was passed on to another. That was how he received the Lee Shinhyuk stigma. He wasn't sure what he was guessing, but he wasn't given much time to figure it out. The woman who had been standing in front of him was menacingly asking one question after another. Whether he was the regressor, why he wasn't answering, she was sure she had sensed the sin star. A moment later he reaffirmed his position as a returnee. He didn't know what Black Heaven or Sinful Star meant, or indeed what the name of the goddess that stood majestically before him was either, but he confirmed the status nonetheless. To survive here, he would have to become one, even if he had to deceive the god. The woman, who had not expressed any emotion for a while, smiled. Without losing her pride, she declared that there was no need to confirm her words, because she already knew that he was a sinful star. The guy was impressed, she believed him. A transcendent with powers the average person could never dream of. Ojin was able to fool God himself. "I'm not going to get fingered afterward, am I?" ran through the nervously smiling lad's mind. The goddess would have liked to discuss the details of his future, but the armored monsters were very much in her way. Of course, it wasn't her job to save the lives of mortals, so the woman turned to the boy, saying she was eager to see the power of the Sin Star for herself. Throwing a frightened glance at the wolves, Ojin had to join the fight. She really wanted him to prove his strength. The goddess asked not to worry the guy, she didn't want to pressure him, after all she had plenty of time. Ojin got caught up in the whole thing. Hovering like a cloud in the sky, the goddess declared that she wanted to see how strong the rising star would be as soon as possible. The pack of wolves walked closer and closer to Kwon Ojin, leaving no choice but to deal with them. One had to get out of the mess somehow. The goddess didn't push him around and waited patiently for the introduction. "Fuck yeah," cussed the guy from the hopelessness of life. Either the goddess would kill him or a bloodthirsty predator would. The scraping of claws cut his ears, irritating his eardrums. The roaring of the beasts was getting closer. Picking up Lee Shinhyek's spear, the guy sighed as he stood in a defensive stance. Energy overflowing, his body felt as light as a feather. Even though he was a low-level star, he had the body of an awakened one. The wolves rushed to grab at least a piece of tasty flesh off the guy. With a few pirouettes, Kwon Ojin slashed the air and the beasts that were on the jump with a light sweep of his arm. This was enough to disarm some of the attackers. The goddess, arms folded across her chest, watched the battle with bated breath. While the goddess was watching the battle, a sneak attack was made on the hero from behind, but he swung his weapon in his hand a few times and pointed it at the rushing wolf. Kwon Ojin couldn't believe his strength, why was it so easy to fight them already? The blood of the wolves poured out after every swing of the spear. A sudden piece of information abruptly flashed through the busy guy's mind. The pixie spear art, level 4 had been obtained. Kwon Ojin was confused trying to figure out what was wrong with his head, besides what other pixie skill was there. The guy who was holding onto the spear leaned over the ground. It had been a hard workout, and it had been a hot day. He had no right to continue like this, and if he stopped, he would never catch up with Wohek. With renewed vigor, the young man began to pound the target doll, worn out by training. Kwon Ojin saw someone's memories, perhaps even bits and pieces of Lee Shinhyek's memory. The guy could see a scar on his left cheek that no one had noticed before. It looked like it was a memory not from the past. Could it be that they were scraps of memories from a past life? Memories from the future. With this information, Ojin could repeat stances he had never learned in his life. In addition, he now had Pixie's skills. Every block the guy made kept him from getting hurt, and every punch brought him closer to victory. But was the first star regressor that strong? In front of the young man lay a pile of dead wolves. As far as he could remember, 1-star retrievers were weaker. Ending the fight, the blonde-haired woman stopped the boy by ordering him to lower his weapon. The disgruntled goddess asked him what he was putting on a show for. Was it planned to amuse her? Sincerely misunderstanding what was going on, Kwon Ojin asked the lady what kind of show she was talking about. Well, if it wasn't a show, why he didn't even use his stigma power. The guy was discouraged, all this time he had been strong enough without using the power of the mark. Seeing the confusion in the guy's eyes, the goddess summarized that maybe even a reborn one has a hard time using the stigma. It must be like getting into the body of a child who is just learning to walk. Hearing this, the guy was surprised at such an inference, having come up with it herself and told it herself. Kwon Ojin couldn't miss such an opportunity, so he decided to take advantage of her stupidity. He confirmed her earlier words with a nod of his head. Holding out her white-gloved hand, the goddess offered to help the baby take its first steps. The boy glowed at the words he heard, he was blessed by Vega herself. The notification of the temporary amplification of Vega's stigma prophecy pierced Ojin's head with pain. Vega, he had heard that name somewhere before. The blue lightning bolt rumbled with a thunderous roar and once again illuminated the entire forest with light. It struck Ojin standing in the field, causing his muscles to contract in spasms. Gathering his strength into a fist, the boy could barely stay on his feet. Self-preservation instinct kicked into overdrive, the remaining wolves bowed their heads with their ears pressed against their heads and crawled back. Through his teeth the young man hissed syllables to the goddess, asking her to at least warn him next time he pulled a stunt like that again. Through tears of pain, the boy thrust the metal spear into the ground. That hurt like hell. Blue Thunder, Level 1. A powerful discharge on the spear entered the wet ground, creating a spider web of fractures. At the end of the skill's effect, the guy looked at the ash-blackened ground. He had wiped out the remaining monsters in a single blow. But still, how could a simple awakened first star be able to do such a thing? One had to reach the second star or even the third star to at least replicate Quan Ojin. Then, what is the stigmata of Vega? As we already knew, the name mentioned in the notifications was Vega. The satisfied goddess praised the guy. He was really gaining experience quite quickly, justifying his status as a regressor. Quan Ojin, who was standing with his back to the goddess, muttered to himself. The only question was whether or not that one was the Star Weaver girl. Hearing the young man's mumbling, Vega put her hand to her cheek and asked the young man if he had called out to her. The boy broke into a sweat. The impossible had happened. The real Vega was standing in front of him. There are dozens or even hundreds of constellations in the sky. All of them are good-looking, but even they are divided into strong and weak. The power of the awakened also varies depending on the rank of the constellation. Among them, there are some noble supreme creatures that even the 12 zodiacs dare not look down upon. Polaris is the alpha of the little bear, Deneb is the brightest star of the constellation of the Swan, and Vega is from the constellation of Vega. One of the highest constellations. She surpassed the others by so much that they dared not raise their heads in her presence. And this goddess was standing right behind Ojin's back, who was freezing just thinking he was deceiving her. Vega tried to talk to the boy, but he didn't listen. Thinking over his plan of action, he realized he was screwed. He'd gone too far, so admitting that he hadn't gone back in time and had lied when he was afraid of her would only lead to an instant shortening of his life. A mere mortal daring to laugh at a god, she would definitely kill him. Well, Quan Ojin started this case, so he must finish it. At any cost. After coming up with a ruse, the guy put his weapon aside and headed towards the woman. Coming quite close, Quan Ojin surprised her by saying that he missed her very much. Taking Vega by the hand, he said his name, eating to remind her who he was. As the performance continued, the boy even cried, a few tears falling onto the woman's white gloves. He assured her that he was thinking of how they would never meet again. What a relief, the boy continued in a shaky voice, pulling her hand closer to his face. The goddess didn't understand what kind of relationship he was talking about. Was it in the future? Quan Ojin had succeeded in getting her hooked. The boy sighed, feigning upset that she didn't remember now, but it was nothing to him. The young man let go of her hand, apologizing for the inconvenience. To the goddess, however, it didn't seem like nothing at all and asked her to tell her what had happened between them. Putting his hand on his heart, he made a sad face that had been through a lot and promised to tell her what the future held for them. After listening to the long and sad story, the goddess replied that she understood what was said. She would eventually be killed, suggesting that all the constellations, including her, would be swallowed by the darkness of the black heavens. Which was, in fact, fate's destiny. But he didn't understand what she was talking about, nor did he understand the logic of her reasoning. Not understanding the woman's logic at all, the guy accepted it, making a smart look and occasionally nodding in agreement. But in their conversation, there had been a mention of black heavens earlier. Vega tried to explain that Mr. Black Heavens was powerful, and if the constellations couldn't stop him, the world would go back to the path of destruction. A nervous chuckle escaped from Quan Ojin's lips, recalling the events earlier. It seemed like she was talking about his abilities. The information after Li Xinhyek's death said that the first bloom of Black Heavens was beginning, which meant Ojin was destined to destroy the entire world. Shocked by the turn of events, Quan Ojin swore loudly in his thoughts. But he's back, so everything will be alright, he asked uncertainly. Then he took Vega's hand again and swore on the spot that she would not be swallowed by the black heavens. He would be her protector. Regressor, Vega began to say, awkwardly correcting the address to awaken Quan Ojin, a rising star who would defy fate. With a light touch of her finger she poked the boy in the forehead, adding that her star would light his hard path. All sorts of information began to flash through his mind. The Weaver's star, Vega, had appointed him as her apostle. Black heavens began to absorb mana from this stigma. The conditions for the black heavens to flourish had been met. Kwon Ojin couldn't believe that he had become Vega's apostle. The path back no longer existed. Quite some time had passed, but the goddess only now turned her gaze to the person lying face down in the ground. She wondered what kind of child it was. Changing his shoes as he walked, the boy averted his gaze and told her that although it was still a couple years away now, Shin-hyuk was a villain who had been breaking in and robbing the innocent. He wasn't essentially lying, it was the truth, but not about Lee Shin-hyuk. Still, he had done a terrible thing to Ojin, so he asked not to despise him too much. The goddess praised the guy, for he had acted as a true regressor, preventing atrocities that would happen in the future. The lad agreed with the statement, only he could do that. Pulling her hand away from the pain around Vega, small sparks began to gather around her that gradually turned into lightning. She asked the guy to pay attention to one more important thing. Of course she would like to talk some more, but it seems that the restrictions of the commandments have already begun to take effect, said the goddess looking at her hands that were glistening with sparks. The young man interrogated the woman as to what the commandments were. Earlier, the goddess Vega had blessed him, which served to break the commandments, though not directly related to that. She was inherently bound to the commandments and had no right to interfere in the affairs of the mortal world. A powerful discharge of electricity struck the ground behind the woman, drowning out some of her words. Her time on earth was coming to an end, it was time for her to leave, but lastly she asked Kwon Ojin to come to her sanctuary in exactly 1 week. That was the end of their conversation, and any questions the guy had would only be asked the next time they met. The lightning subsided and the goddess dissolved into a bright blue flash. With loud mats the guy fell to the ground. A multitude of things were happening at once, bringing his thoughts into disarray. It was driving him insane. Bringing his hand up to his stigma, Ojin couldn't believe he had gotten the mark of the northern constellation. It wasn't so bad after all. Thanks to Lee Shin-hyuk's death, Kwon Ojin's life had completely changed. Turning around to the body, the guy hesitantly thanked the one for this chance. Well, from now on, he's the returned one. When Ojin came to his senses and recovered from his experience, he went home and went to a local fast food restaurant and ordered 2 Big Macs, which cost him almost $16. On his way home, he wondered why these hamburgers were so expensive, since they didn't seem to be anything special. Walking through the narrow streets and crosswalks, he slowly approached home. And when he finally opened the door to his house, he said loudly that he was home, as if he were not alone. And it was true, because there was a red-haired girl waiting for him, who was happy to see him. But there was something wrong with her. She was awake but on the bed in complete darkness, and when our hero entered the room, he turned on the light, which blinded him. However, the girl didn't seem to notice it at all and only asked why he came back later than usual. The girl's name was Song Ha-eun, and she was his only support during his hellish time in the orphanage. And many years later, she was still the only ray of sunshine in his life. Song smiled at him and told him that since he was back, he should give her a cigarette instead of just standing there. Ojin tiredly told her that she shouldn't spout bullshit as soon as he got back. She asked what he meant by bullshit. Was that something she should say to an elder, since she was 2 years older than him, so she was an elder? He replied her that she's his elder ass. But it was all friendly banter, so he went on to tell her that he had bought some hamburgers and gave her one in her hand. She was very grateful for his concern. She had a sad story. She was an awakener, but since then in one of the battles she lost her right leg and became completely blind. And that's why their roles were reversed and now he was the one who took care of her. Until now, many years after they left the orphanage, their bond with each other has only grown stronger with each passing day. Even though it was dangerous and awkward. Suddenly, after taking a few bites of the hamburger, the girl asked what it was. Our hero could not understand what was wrong. It turned out that she was also curious how a burger could be so delicious. But there was a simple explanation for this, because he brought her a burger cooked in a fast food restaurant, instead of a frozen one bought in a store, as he had done before. Hearing this, the girl was surprised and asked him if he had hurt himself somewhere or if a monster had hit him on the head or something. After all, this was completely unlike him, as he had never spent extra money before. He simply said that he had earned some money. He thought that he only had to save a little bit more. After all, He just wanted to save some money, and after all, he was going to buy something for her. She sensed that he had stopped talking and looked at him questioningly. Ojin noticed a stain of sauce on his face and informed her about it. She asked in surprise what was wrong. But after a few minutes of unsuccessfully trying to find the stain herself, she asked him if he could also tell her where the sauce was. But he told her to just eat, because she was ugly regardless of whether she had sauce on her face or not. Ojin started to tell her that today he bought burger combos instead of frozen ones, and the name of this hamburger is the Big Mac combo, and also on his way home. However, Song listened to his meaningless story and tensed up. Something in his behavior and words was wrong. She stopped his monologue and said confidently, "Something happened, didn't it?" Even though she was blind, she still knew him too well and immediately noticed his unusual behavior. He realized that all his disguises had failed, although this was expected since he couldn't keep anything hidden from her. There was no point in hiding anymore, so he admitted that he was awakened. He heard that she didn't even believe it at first. But when she realized what he had said a moment later, she dropped her ice-cold Coke on the bed. Now our protagonist had to explain to her for a long time everything she could understand about his awakening. When he finally answered all the questions, he had the opportunity to be alone for a while and understand everything more deeply. Because he still did not fully understand what had happened. It was quite late after all these explanations for her, and it was probably natural for her to be surprised. But still, how could he explain that he had lied to a constellation about being a regressor? Of course, it was complicated and she had a lot of questions to which he could not give her a proper answer. And now he had to check everything himself and try to put together a complete picture of his capabilities and what had happened to him. First of all, he was going to understand what this Black Heaven skill meant. Information windows appeared in front of him, showing all his skills. It turned out that the Black Heaven skill was his innate skill and he was now at its initial stage, first awakening. The next skill was Stigma Absorption, which allowed him to absorb Stigma mana and store it within the Black Heaven. The passive skill Black Curtain completely shrouds the Black Heaven presence, and this trait can also be used on possessed stigmas. The third skill was Transmission, which allowed him to read the records contained in absorbed stigmas, and this trait is influenced according to the awakening stage. The system also informed him that his current possessed stigma was Vega. After reading all this, our hero was surprised to find out that the unknown force that absorbed Li Xinhyek's stigma had always been with him. Now he was sure that the Black Heaven skill was unrelated to Li Xinhyek's regression. He remembered how Vega had told him that whoever possessed Black Heaven would destroy the world in the future. And that meant that sometime in the future he would do it himself. Now he was horrified by what had happened to him in his past life and didn't understand what had to happen to him to make him want to destroy the world. But still, it didn't really matter now, because now he had to focus on not getting caught. Because as soon as someone found out that he had Black Heaven, then they would also know that he didn't come back from the future, but just someone unrelated who had absorbed a regressor's stigma. Now he was not at all happy about all the chaos he had been dragged into. Now he had only one question: what should he do next? That regressor, he needed to be like that regressor. And to do that, he decided to first get Vega's recognition, which would allow him to stay above suspicion. In order to do this, he needed to hurry up and raise the level of his stigma, Vega. So he needed to at least hit 2 stars by next week. And it didn't look like it would be a problem, since he was already full of stigma mana and all he had to do was learn how to manage it. He would have to start tomorrow and go straight to the gate to start killing monsters for practice. But for now, he needed a good night's sleep. However, he received some interesting news on his smartphone. The news said that anomalies had been discovered and the chance of mutants appearing had increased many times over, even in 1-star locations and dungeons. As an example, a pack of mutated wolves was sighted, the victims of which were one newcomer after another. Therefore, the news warned that a super mutant boss might also appear, so they warned newcomers to refrain from visiting the location with monsters for a while. Looking at the photo of the location, our hero realized that this was exactly the location he was at today. Now he understood the appearance of so many monsters at that location, but still mutants, he knew something about them. In their world, mutants were mutated monsters with extremely low spawning chances. Although mutants are different in some scenarios, mutant species tend to be stronger than their non-mutant counterparts. It's something that a new one-star awakener wouldn't dream of defeating. Back then, during the battle with the wolves, he hadn't paid attention to it, maybe he had missed it because he was worried about other things. However, now he knew for sure that his destination for tomorrow was definitely defined. The next day he came to the same place. There were already a number of awakeners there, looking for helpers. One of them realized the danger to himself and was about to pack his bags, but still most of them were confident in their abilities and were going to hunt monsters here. Ojin watched all this and thought that despite the fact that the news warned not to approach this place, there were more people here than usual. The reason was simple, everyone had gathered here for the mutant crystals, which were more expensive than usual. Our protagonist even thought about joining a group like he did before, but now with his new power he decided to destroy all the mutants on his own because he didn't want to share his profits with anyone. He went through the magic gate and found himself in the middle of a dark forest. Making his way through the bushes, he gradually approached the center of the location, and everything seemed to be quiet around him. Suddenly, however, he heard a growl from some bushes and the red eyes of a pack of wolves became visible. They did not waste a minute and immediately rushed at our hero. It seemed that he was caught off guard. And the wolves were approaching him from all sides. However, he saw everything, and the wolf that was sneaking up on him from behind immediately got hit in the head. And the other one that tried to attack him from above. He also failed to hit his target. Moreover, Ojin was able to catch the wolf in flight by its hind leg. And painfully land it on the ground. While he was dealing with the wolf that jumped on him, another wolf that was pinned to the ground by the spear started to try to run away, but Ojin saw it and asked him where he was going. With one powerful kick, he simply crushed the wolf. And he shouted at him goodbye, saying that since he had come to him, he had to pay for it. The other wolf took advantage of this opportunity and began to run away with tears in his eyes. However, he did not have time to reach his pack. The beam of energy released by our protagonist simply destroyed them all. And only smoke rose above the forest, which was again enveloped in silence. Ojin was surprised by his new strength, his physical skills were at an extremely high level. The body of a single wolf usually weighs 80 kilograms and it's actually not that easy to defeat them, especially for beginners, but he could juggle them as he wanted. And with a minimum of desire, he could destroy them with a single blow. In any case, the main thing was ahead for him. And the main thing for him, of course, was the money he could get for the crystals collected from their carcasses. Picking up one of the crystals, he thought that it would be worth more than 800,000 won, and that is the reason why everyone wants to become an awakener. After searching all the corpses, he was about to leave when he heard a noise behind him. Ojin was waiting for him, but he wasn't sure he would show up so soon, so he asked him if he had come to smell the blood of his friends. A mutant boss appeared, looking like a mix of a wolf and an ant, and there were several smaller wolves with him. It was definitely a mutant boss, and blind animal fury burned in his eyes. He immediately rushed to attack. However, Ojin was not surprised at all, and for him everything now began to resemble a fun game. So he mockingly asked if the mutant boss had lost all fear, how dare he attack him right away. Well, okay, if that's the case then. He activated the first level lightning strike skill. His eyes lit up with blue lightning. So did his spear, which he threw violently at his opponent. It turned out that the strike was so powerful that it destroyed the boss with just one blow. Even the protagonist himself was surprised by this and could not believe that such a dangerous-looking boss died from just one blow. He stood in the middle of the clearing and asked himself, did it work? But that didn't seem to bother our hero at all, and something else caught his attention. It was the surviving remnants of the pack who were now not thrilled at the prospect of fighting such a strong warrior. Ojin only had time to shout at them that they could run away, but they had to give him the crystals first. He couldn't run after them, as he got a new notification from the system in front of him. His Vega stigma increased to level 2. Ojin expected to level up faster since he had a large amount of mana from the stigma. But the fact that he was able to reach the second star in one day was very unusual. He could feel the power flowing through him and filling his body. He was about to leave and decided to quickly take everything useful from the body of the slain boss. But suddenly two strangers started approaching him. They greeted him and were surprised that he was able to kill the mutant boss alone. Their look immediately disliked our hero. There was something unpleasant and insincere in it. The strangers introduced themselves as 3-star students of the Venetisi Kane. But there was something strange about their presence here. There was no way a third leveler could have come to such a low-level gate. Could they have come specifically for the mutants? Or were they after some other nefarious purpose? Besides, he had a feeling they had thieves written on their foreheads. But until they were clearly aggressive, he didn't want to use force. But in the next moment they dispelled all his doubts when they said that they were the very mutants they had chased and lost before, and now it was not good that he had stolen their prey. Looking at their smug smiles, he realized that he had no other choice. The next moment he fell on his knees before them and began to tearfully beg their forgiveness, for he did not know that it was their booty. The robbers were expecting any kind of reaction, resistance, protest, attack, but the fact that he began to tearfully apologize surprised them. Ojin tearfully assured them that he would give them everything. The robbers even felt uneasy at how quickly he realized what they wanted from him. They relaxed and thought he was a weak little brat, and not expecting him to be a threat they turned their backs on him, pointing to a place off to the side where they wanted to talk to him, but it was clear that he wouldn't come back from those bushes. So with one sudden jerk he pierced one of the relaxed robbers with his spear. And with a smug smile said to him, "You miserable crook will order what to do only to your mommy in hell." The robbers didn't expect such sudden resistance at all and at first didn't even realize what had happened. However, the living robber came to his senses quite quickly and called the protagonist a fucking devil and attacked him. But his attack was too slow and our hero easily dodged it. The robber immediately realized that they had confused who the victim was, because their opponent was too fast and was just hiding his power by taunting them. Ojin also realized that he was just a couple of weaklings and decided not to delay the show. He ended the battle with a single lightning strike, striking the robber with a spear of lightning. He was finally able to exhale quietly and enjoy the silence. He was now glad that no one else would stop him from further collecting crystals. However, when he was searching the corpses of the robbers he saw their stigmas glowing on their bodies. He remembered that his Black Heaven skill was supposed to become stronger when he absorbed the stigmas of others. And now he wondered if he should try this skill now. Of course it would be very bad if someone found out about it, but one feature of the Black Heavens was the black curtain that allowed him to hide his skills, so he was willing to take the risk. So he put his hand on the robber's stigma. Energy discharges immediately flowed from it to his hand. Then, information windows appeared in front of him, congratulating him for absorbing the Venetisi Kane stigma and fulfilling the conditions for obtaining the second level of the Black Heavens. And because of this, his Black Heavens skill was beginning its second enlightenment. His entire body was engulfed in dark lightning. And he couldn't hold back a cry of pain when new memories from other people's past lives began to enter his mind. These memories were all read from Vega's stigma, but they were limited due to the low level of enlightenment of the Black Heavens. Lee Shinhyek's memories began to appear before his eyes, who was lying with his head bandaged in front of a man in a white medical coat. He was in a hospital room and judging by the time and date it had to be in the near future as well as the past. The man in the robe announced to Lee Shinhyek that he had been unconscious for 2 weeks. And he didn't seem happy about it at all, because he asked him why he went back into the gate by himself and didn't tell the others. Lee apologized and justified that he thought everything would be fine since it was only a 1-star gate. Their conversation was interrupted and someone entered the chamber. It was the assistant guild master who had some urgent news. It turned out that the man in the robe was the head of the guild, and now the assistant had informed him that a new gate had opened in Mokdon on 15th Street, and it looked like a holy relic had been found there. But what one of the guild members had told him about that gate was a little strange. The memories started to fade. And then they disappeared completely. Ojin felt like he had woken up from some strange dream. He wasn't thrilled that Lee Shinhyek's memories kept popping up. But as it turned out, there were many benefits to it, because thanks to those memories, he was able to pump his Pixis Spear Arts skill up to level 5. And he had also learned a new one, level 2 Lame Excuses. He immediately had many questions, the first of which was what else were lame excuses. He also wondered if he could unlock more memories if he became more enlightened. But he also had to decide what he should do with the information he received. After all, knowing where the new gate with the holy relic would open allowed him to prepare, to come up with a plan, to gather a team, or to try to do it all alone and get there first and guarantee himself a relic. In this world, holy relics were items that held the power of the stars, and some of them were so powerful that they covered the difference between the first and second star. And according to the memories he had received, a holy relic was going to appear in Mokdan in 8 days. It was great information that he could use to his advantage. But there was more to the memories than that. There was another way he could use them to his advantage. To do so, he returned to the city to sell the crystals he had obtained. As usual, there were many novice awakened who were trying to sell their first trophies from monsters. When he went to the cashier and showed his crystals, she appraised them and said that they were worth $1,440, but after tax deduction, the payout would be $1,152. When he heard that, he said damn. The cashier of course didn't understand him and asked him what was wrong, but he said everything was fine. Inside he was burning with resentment. He was shocked at the 20% tax. Now he realized where the real robbers were, not in the woods at all. But then he thought about it for a while and realized that it probably wasn't as bad as it could have been. Then he sat down to wait for his money to be brought to him. When his number was called, he went to the cash register. But before giving him his money, the cashier asked him what constellation he was connected to. He calmly answered, Vega. When the cashier heard this, she was shocked. She asked him to repeat the name of his constellation again. Ojin first just repeated Vega, and then to clear all doubts he spelled Vega again. The shocked cashier couldn't even answer, so he had to ask her to hurry up. But it looked like this was just the beginning of his adventures here, and she asked him to go to the waiting room. Going there, he thought it would be a good idea to find out more information for the future while remaining unnoticed and unknown. But that would be too stupid and he would waste a lot of time. After all, fame was a power that had to be used. He was led to the VIP waiting room and asked to wait here for a while. As it turned out, there was someone else here. Some cocky guy who saw that he was being stared at responded with a haughty look at the protagonist. Then he asked him what he was staring at and advised him to stare at the floor. Ojin looked at him suspiciously, not sure what the hell he was looking at. Kwon Ojin looked at the guy who was staring at him with a disgruntled look and wondered who the bastard was. He decided to ignore him and stared at the drinks on the table, which were of much greater value to him at that moment. However, in the next moment, his eyes widened in shock when he saw the dessert that was only served to VIPs. He immediately drooled and remembered how jealous he was of those assholes who ate such things back in the days when he was a crook. He sat down at the table and began stuffing his mouth while thinking about how much there was in there. While he was enjoying the delicious food, the blonde-haired guy looked at him with bewilderment and disdain. Never mind that, the protagonist told himself that he would have to take what was left with him, because his Nuna would surely be very happy if he brought something tasty. However, his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the voice of a guy who contemptuously asked him if he was a beggar or a bum. Kwon Ojin silently shifted his gaze to him. Looking at the haughty guy who scornfully asked why he was slurping so loudly, he wondered what was wrong with him. Swallowing the last of his food, our protagonist grinned and replied that he'd been very brave. Adding that he was glad to see that the youth was full of energy, and could even afford to act without thinking of the consequences. Hearing this, he asked irritably what the hell he was talking about. The protagonist smiled and calmly asked if he knew who he was talking to. He asked who he was talking to, not so confidently. He smirked and said that this is what leads to the fact that he has not been active lately. Then he put his hands in front of him and looked at the guy and said that the person in the VIP room should know him. The guy's face was already starting to show concern. After all, the interlocutor sitting in front of him was emitting a dangerous aura and smiling evilly. Besides, judging by his confidence, he could be a big shot. It immediately struck him, because he had already heard that if one were to overcome the 9 awakening stars, one's body could become younger. Moreover, judging from the fact that he was also sent to the VIP room. However, his train of thought was interrupted by Kwon Ojin, who called him a boy and asked him what guild he was from. The guy started to speak, but the protagonist immediately stopped him. He smiled menacingly and told him to watch his tongue. This was the last straw that completely destroyed the arrogance of the guy. In the next second, he jumped up and bowed respectfully and replied that his name was Park Young-woo, and that he was from the Pandius Guild. Upon hearing this, Kwon Ojin remembered that this guild was one of the best in Korea, and consisted of awakened scorpions. He immediately casually replied that of course he knew one. The blonde-haired guy immediately asked incredulously if he knew the master of his guild. He smiled and replied that of course he did, adding that he didn't just know him, but even in the old days they used to have snacks together and go to saunas, adding that the asshole had risen quite a bit during that time. The guy immediately turned pale and covered with sweat, as he realized that disrespect to such a man could cost him. The protagonist continued to improvise, and asked the guy if he could pass his words to the head of the guild. He immediately replied excitedly that yes, and asked how he could introduce him. He smiled slightly and asked the guy to say that they were from Kwon Ojin. Hearing this, the guy immediately started apologizing for not recognizing him right away and being so rude. Ojin smiled devilishly to himself and said that he had been fooling people for years, that this guy was too easy. When he came to his senses, he replied that he shouldn't worry, because everyone makes mistakes. To which he replied in a panic that he had not just made a mistake, but had made a huge mistake. Not wanting to miss such an opportunity, the protagonist asked if he would not do him a favor in this case, to which he immediately replied that he would do anything. After a while, there was food in bags on the table. Park Young-woo, standing at the side of the table, reported that he had packed everything and even took some from the refrigerator. Kwon Ojin smiled and praised him, and thought to himself that Nona would be surprised to see what he had brought. At the same time, the guy also awkwardly said that it was already time for him to go back. Hearing this, the protagonist asked in surprise if he hadn't come to the registration exam. He replied that he suddenly didn't feel well. After bowing and wishing him goodbye, he left the room. As soon as he left, Kwon Ojin smirked slyly and said to himself that he was able to get out of trouble quite easily. Kwon Ojin looked at the expensive wallet he was holding. As it turned out, the wallet he took from the guy had quite a bit of cash in it, which pleased him a lot. The next thing he found in the wallet, however, surprised him. In his hands he held a shiny black crystal that had the name Mutant's Mur on it. Carrying something like that in his wallet was very unusual, and he immediately wondered how it had gotten there. Mutants that were used to mine these crystals were very rare, but the Mur crystals themselves were very difficult to obtain. But what was even stranger was what the crystal was doing in Park Jung-woo's wallet. Saying to himself that this was something to be dealt with, he wanted to say something else, but he was interrupted by a sound coming from the other side of the door. The next moment the door opened and a stranger entered, apologizing for the long wait. This stranger was a young tall guy who extended his hand to him and said that his name was Han Jun-man, the captain of the association team of the Special Security Department of the Disaster Countermeasures Headquarters. After introducing himself, he added that he was pleased to meet the Vega stigma holder. After shaking his hand, the protagonist said that it was also a pleasure to meet him, and also noted to himself that the guy had a great physique. However, what made this person stand out was that he was incredibly strong, and not at all comparable to Park Young-woo. Deciding to drag it out, he immediately asked what constellation he was in, to which he replied that he was a 6-star awakened calf. Hearing this, Kwon Ojin noted that this constellation was one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, which in itself was incredible. At the same time, Han Jun-man looked at him carefully. Then he asked him in a serious voice if he really had a Vega stigma. Seeing the look on his face, the protagonist immediately realized that he didn't believe him. However, it was understandable since he was the first awakened person to receive the stigma. He lifted up his shirt and showed him the mark on his chest, which was glowing with a bright blue light. However, even after seeing the mark, he still stared at it in disbelief. Suddenly turning to the protagonist, he asked if he would mind if he conducted the registration exam himself. Such a request surprised the protagonist a bit. And for a second, a look of despondency appeared on his face. But after a moment, he replied without much enthusiasm in his voice that of course he could do it. After a while, they were on the sparring ground. Kwon Ojin was holding a halberd, while Han Junman was wearing only boxing gloves. Turning to the latter, the protagonist asked if he could use this as a sparring weapon, to which he smiled and said yes. Holding the weapon in his hands, and looking at his opponent who was a 6-star awakened, he couldn't help but be curious that even if Vega's stigma was unique, would it be able to cover the difference of 4 stars? And even more so when fighting an awakened one with the stigma of one of the 12 zodiac signs. However, there was only one way to test it, and that was to test it in battle. The next second, he pushed himself off the ground with all his might and rushed towards Han Junman, who was standing in a stance waiting for his attack. A look of bewilderment appeared on his face as he approached. In the next second, as soon as the protagonist collided with him, a huge amount of lightning appeared around them. At this moment, a look of genuine surprise appeared on the guy's face, as evidenced by his wide-open eyes looking at Kwon Ojin confusedly. He definitely didn't expect such strength and speed from a con man.